The one thing is the surprisingly simple truth behind extraordinary results. And that simple truth is that extraordinary results doesn't come by doing more. It comes by doing more of what matters most.
Welcome to the Strategic Momentum Podcast, the show where we share tips, stories, and advice from progressive leaders on what it takes to break through that business inertia and propel you and your business forward. I'm your host, Connie Steele. With growing demands on our time, the aspect of being able to manage it all professionally and personally is a challenge that is often on the top of everyone's list. So what does it take to create that focus in order to drive positive momentum for you, your company, and your career? Geoff Woods is the vice president of The One Thing, the training company behind the top-rated business book, where he works alongside billionaire Gary Keller and his New York Times bestselling co-author, Jay Papasan, to teach people how to live a life of focus so they can have more and do less. In this episode, Geoff shares insights on what gets people stuck when it comes to time management, the lies of productivity many succumb to, and the valuable goal-setting processes that lead to doing more of what matters most. Geoff's journey to The One Thing began when two life events caused him to disrupt his own perspective, leading him to re-examine his values and ultimately his end goals.
Before doing what I do now, I was in medical device sales, which was such a fun job. I got to wear scrubs every day. I ran through hospitals. I sold a device that actually saved lives. I tried to get my wife to call me McDreamy. She refused, but you can't win all the battles. And I remember being really happy in my career, but also not being entirely fulfilled. You ever been there, Connie?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. And I remember, hindsight's 2020. If I look back on it now, I didn't have enough pain in my life to really force me to ask the tougher questions or take action on them. But two things did happen in my life that forced a change. And the first was, I remember my wife and I had just bought a house in Orange County. We just had our first child. My wife makes the decision to become a stay-at-home mom. I'm now the sole provider for the family. And my colleague has a stroke at 35 years old.
Oh, wow.
And that rocked me because I remember thinking, what happens to my family if that was me? And that was very unsettling. And the next week, my company needed to make a change to our commission structure in order to remain competitive in the marketplace. And while they did the right thing for the company, I lost 40% of my income overnight. And when you take those two things back to back and our bank account is almost out of money, I start to ask a different question. I realized that I was not as secure as I thought I was. And at the time, I had heard this Jim Rohn quote that you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. And I remember Connie standing in my kitchen, hearing that quote, looking down at my scrubs and asking, who are my 5? And I searched for the answer and I wrote the names down. And I remember looking at the list and thinking, wow, these are great people. I love them. I always want them to be in my life. And then I had the aha moment. I was treating these people like they were the solution for every relationship in my life. Meaning I was seeking guidance on how to build a business from people who were not qualified to give it. I was not surrounded by people who were where I wanted to be. And so I set an intention to while maintaining relationships with those people as friends, I would go out and surround myself with people who were where I wanted to be.
How'd you go about doing that?
Yeah, that's how much time do you got? It started by getting clear on what I wanted. And at the time, I thought I wanted to get into real estate investing, specifically commercial real estate. And I started showing up to networking events. I started attending conferences. But the most powerful thing I understood was that in every conversation I had with people, they would always ask a question like, what's new? What's going on? What's up? And a common response to that is what?
Not much, or, things are good, or honestly, sometimes it's a little awkward. You don't know what to say.
Yeah. The most common is not much. And I realized, something hit me and it was like, oh my gosh, that's a wasted opportunity. They literally just asked me what's new or what's going on in my life. And the answer is not much. That is depressing. Something was going on in my life. I had gotten clarity that I wanted to get into real estate investing and that I was looking to surround myself with successful commercial real estate investors. And what was crazy about this, Connie, is the very first time I was sitting in front of somebody and they said, "So how can I help you?" And I just nervously blurted out, "I'm looking to get into real estate and I'm looking to surround myself with successful commercial real estate investors." The guy sat back in his chair and just started rocking back and forth, back and forth. I could tell he was thinking and I didn't know what to do. So I just stayed quiet. And he finally looked at me and said, "You know what? Come to my house tomorrow." And I was shocked because this is the first time I'm sitting down with this guy. I perceived him to be a very heavy hitter. I was putting him on a pedestal and he's inviting me to his house because there was a guy that was going to be there that he said had a pretty interesting track record. So I showed up to his house. I met Dave, the real estate investor, and came to find out that Dave had done 10,000 commercial real estate deals. Dave took a liking to me and took me under his wing and started mentoring me. And about 6 months later, I got a call from Dave saying, "Hey, I'm about to take a building down on the East Coast. I want you to join me as a partner. Take whatever money you can, throw it in, have a piece of equity, and go along for the ride to learn." That was from the first time I opened my mouth. And I got stories like that for days. So when we ask the question, how do you surround yourself with people who are where you want to be? You first and foremost have to ask the question, what do I actually want in my life? And who's the type of person I'm looking to meet? And be able to say it in a sentence so that when people ask you what's new, what's up, what's going on, what's up, instead of saying nothing much, you actually start leveraging 6 degrees of separation.
Well, it also sounds like when you did convey that, you also convey that from a very genuine and authentic place, because in many situations, when you meet new people, the networking is uncomfortable and it's very transactional. You don't feel like it's about necessarily helping people. Mm-hmm. It's about mining someone for as much as they can give you.
So this ties in perfectly to how we get to what I do today. When I started surrounding myself with people who are where I wanted to be, I noticed that they didn't show up in the room looking to get. They showed up looking to give. The most successful people weren't looking over your shoulder when they were talking to you to see if there was somebody better they should be talking to. They were genuinely present. And in the back of their mind, they were actually wondering how they could support you. And it was so shocking to me, Connie, that I just decided to become that type of person. Well, you fast forward, it's my medical device sales national sales meeting. And I walk into the room and on every single chair was a copy of The One Thing, one of the highest rated business books of all time. And I remember picking up the book and looking and going, okay, this is cool. And out on stage walked Jay Papasan, who co-authored the book with Gary Keller. For those of you who know of Keller Williams, the real estate company, it's that Gary Keller. So for the next hour, Jay proceeded to blow my mind. And I thought, I'm on the hunt to upgrade my 5. And here's Jay. And so when he finished speaking, I'm like, I got to talk to this guy. But then all the limiting beliefs started to sit in. Like, what could I say to him that would make it worth his time or make him interested in me? Why would he even spend time with me? But before you know it, I'm running down the side of this conference room knowing I have to talk to him. And when I approached him, I introduced myself, I thanked him for the speech, and I asked him what they were focusing on and how I could help. And his answer was, we're looking for more exposure for the book. And I said, well, I have this brand new podcast called The Mentee. I would love to feature you and help more people know about the book. He said yes, which shocked me. And at the end of the interview, I asked him again, what are you focusing on? How can I help? And he said, we're looking for more exposure for the book. He had no clue at the time that I was writing for entrepreneur.com. And without even telling him, I just wrote an article and published it. And I started sharing it on social media. And pretty quickly, I saw him sharing all of my posts. And so I replied back to him, what are you focusing on? How can I help? This is the 3rd time I've asked how I can support him. I've never asked for a thing and I've delivered every single time. And this 3rd time when he answered, he said, Gary and I are looking for a CEO for a publishing company. And I remember racking my brain and going, I actually knew 3 people that might be a great fit. And so I said, let's talk so I can learn about the position and make the right introduction. And when we got on the phone, he really surprised me, Connie, because he didn't describe any of the 3 people I was thinking of. He described me. And you fast forward, I had an opportunity to move my family to Austin, Texas to turn this book into a training company that'll change the way people view time.
Wow. And this is coming from somebody who's in the sales profession. And usually there's a bad rap with folks who are in sales because it is about, give me what you have. Let me sell to you. Not necessarily about paying it forward and truly altruistically wanting to support the other person on the other side in whatever way possible.
Yep.
Learning of Jim Rohn's belief that you are the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with, coupled with life-changing events he experienced, caused Geoff to re-examine what he wanted in life. Defining his purpose and seeking to surround himself with those who were more ideally aligned to helping him get to where he wanted to be, altered his trajectory for the better. This clarity of vision has led him to where he is today. So what is the premise behind the one thing and some of the core models behind it?
The one thing is the surprisingly simple truth behind extraordinary results. And that simple truth is that extraordinary results doesn't come by doing more. It comes by doing more of what matters most. And I think when I look back at what got me here, being the type of person who would come from contribution, who would bring value first, who learned to ask the right questions. Questions are at the core of this. And when I look at the training that we do, whether it's with individuals inside of companies, whether they're small and then all the way up to the Fortune 50, it comes down to teaching people how to ask questions so they think differently. And that's really what leadership is.
Why do you think this whole premise of asking the right question to deliver value first and foremost is not something that people are accustomed to doing?
I don't think we were taught how to ask great questions.
You think we're just taught to just respond or at least ask questions that are about what you want?
My last coach, asked me a really powerful question. He asked me, what's the impact our business will be making 200 years from now? And where do we need to be in the next 5 to 10 years to feel like we're on track? And for a question so big, I actually had an instant answer, which is we've changed the way that people view time. And here's what I mean about this. And this is what feeds into your question, Connie. When most people wake up, what's the first thing they do?
Check email.
After pressing snooze, they usually check email or check social media. And then they stop doing that and they start getting ready for the day. They show up to the office. They open their computer and do what?
Check email again.
Until they go to a
meeting
and get out and check
email and through the meeting.
Until somebody interrupts them by asking, hey, do you got a minute? And this cycle repeats all day long. And we wonder why. We look up at the end of the day and we go, I was busy. Did I get anything done?
Very true.
We live in such a reactive culture with technology today. Unconsciously, we have formed addiction to stimulus. It's why we check email when we ask what should we be doing right now. And when we don't have an instant answer, we crave stimulus, we check email. It's why when we don't know what we should be doing, we feel like we should just go talk to somebody. Or if somebody asks if we've got a minute because we're not clear on what our one thing is in that moment, we just blindly say yes. And so part of the reason we exist is because we want to create a world where people wake up and they invest every single second like it's their most valuable resource. Because it is. And that starts by giving people clarity on what their priorities are, helping them feel a sense of control over their time so that they can actually build a community that supports their goals. And it's that lack of clarity, that lack of control, and that lack of community, which is why we don't know the questions we should be asking and why we are reactive versus responsive.
So with those 3 tenets, that lack of clarity, that lack of control, and that lack of community, does that also all feed into this, which I know you call an 80-20 sort of situation that people fall into, where most of the time they spend 80% of their time on things that probably don't have that effective impact, where it should be, you spend 20% of your time to get 8% of those positive results and impact.
Yeah. And this is what you're getting into is the core models behind the one thing. And the 80-20 rule, the idea that 80% of your results come from 20% of your activities. Like it's so powerful. And we create these models that we help, whether it's an individual, a team, or an entire company, have clarity on what their 20% is. And of all the things that comprise the 20%, being able to rank them in order of priority. If you could only accomplish one thing this year, what is it? Should you earn the right to accomplish a second thing? What is it? Should you earn the right to accomplish a third? What is it? And pay attention to the language I'm using. It's very intentional. And that way, people know their priorities. They have clarity on their priorities. And when everybody has clarity on their priorities, all of a sudden you create alignment, which gives people a sense of control. And when everybody knows what their one thing is and they have a common language so that they can communicate with one another, you build a sense of community.
So that structure, I don't think anybody would have necessarily looked at it that way. I think, if I think of my own experience or I think of the experiences of others, the first thing they think of in order to say, get the clarity and get the control is start off with a to-do list, right? And so I think there are common misconceptions as to the way to organize your day and the way to create that productive structure. So, let's talk about that. I'm very curious to get your perspective on, what are these common misconceptions and why do people believe that, it's about to-do lists, it's about maybe multitasking. So sure. Please share.
Yeah, what you're hinting at are some of the lies of productivity. And the first lie, and Gary and Jay would argue it's the number one, it's the first lie because it is the most important one, is the lie that everything matters equally. And I don't think there's a single person listening to this that says that everything on their plate matters equally. Yet, if we followed you around with a camera in a very non-creepy way, very professional, you're actually being recorded right now, you just didn't know it, and documented your every single move, what we would see most people doing is checking email, sitting in meetings, and getting distracted by the people around them. I learned this the hard way, Connie, because we have a framework. We call it a GPS. It's a one-page business plan because it's really tough to be on the same page with your team if your plan literally doesn't fit on the same page. And a GPS, it's a one big goal at the top. You have 3 priorities that you can focus on to accomplish the big goal. And then you have 5 strategies to accomplish each priority. And I remember I had to do my GPS for Gary and Jay in my first 90 days. I had to prove that I could cast a vision for the business and get it onto one page. And I walked into this boardroom with Gary and Jay, and I handed each of them a copy of my GPS. And we started going over priority number 1. And Gary and Jay asked a bunch of questions. I remember answering them and saying, "Are we good?" And they went, "Yep." And I moved on number 2. And about halfway through number 2, I remember Gary went back and started asking more questions about priority number 1. And I didn't think anything of it at the time. I just answered them. I said, "Are we good?" They go, "Yeah." And so I said, "Okay, we're good." So I finished up number 2 and started talking about priority number 3. And Gary started asking more questions about number 1. Connie, have you ever seen the movie Meet the Parents?
Yes.
You know, the circle of trust?
Yes.
I felt in that moment like I was not in the circle of trust. Like, why does Gary keep going back to number 1? But I did the best I could. I answered the questions. I said, "Are we good, Gary?" And he said, "Yeah." And I went back to number 3. And after about 10 seconds of talking, he just stopped me. And he asked, "Geoff, do you need to do number 3 in order to do number 2? I thought about it. And I said, "No." He then asked, "Do you need to do number 2 in order to do number 1? Thought about it. I said, "No." He said, "Then do me a favor. Draw a line between number 1 and number 2. Or even better, rip the page in half." Connie, he literally waited while I ripped my business plan in half. And then he said, "Don't even think about number 2 or number 3 until you've earned the right to by mastering number 1.
So in that moment, I can only imagine what it felt like in that moment.
Mind explosion.
Yeah. But what you went through and the way that you laid out your business plan, which certainly you laid out all these different priorities, which I think is a tendency of most people, is that it's about volume. It's about everything that you could possibly do without necessarily understanding potentially how one ties to another or which one of them has the greatest impact on the end goal that you're trying to accomplish in whatever fashion it may be. Fair? This lack of clarity, control, and community is often what prevents us from getting to that 80-20 rule. And that stems from some of those lies of productivity, such as everything on one's plate matters equally. Further, the common habit of defining goals and subsequent priorities through to-do lists places a false value on each task. This pattern, however, can be disrupted by working toward a singular goal, identifying a few priorities that support that goal, and then defining corresponding activities, 5 for each based on the One Thing's GPS plan, that will help you drive toward that goal completion. Ultimately, this control over time and an emphasis on quality over quantity comes when clarity on long-term objectives is achieved. Yet making this change of habit isn't easy. As Geoff explains, many workers are unintentionally hitting a ceiling on their productivity.
Well, it comes down, a lot of people are asking themselves the wrong question. See, we're getting back to the questions. A lot of people are asking, what's the best that I can do? And the best you can do is actually irrelevant. Because when you rely on your natural abilities, you're acting entrepreneurially. It's like jumping out of the plane and building a parachute on the way down. Most people hit a ceiling of achievement in their life because they are acting entrepreneurially, doing what comes naturally to them. That's what most people do. They wake up, they see everything that's on their plate, and they just take action. The opportunity and the only way you break through that ceiling of achievement and get to the next level is when you move from being entrepreneurial to being purposeful. Not asking what's the best that I can do, asking what's the best that can be done. And finding models and systems that reflect the best that can be done and adopting them as your own. And when I talk through a GPS, a one-page business plan, that is a model that is the best that can be done for creating clarity and alignment inside an organization. So just stop relying on your own natural abilities and go out and look for examples of what it looks like at the highest level and just rinse and repeat.
So what would that look like if you could operationalize that for someone and say they have that challenge with defining what the clarity is for whatever goal they may have, because they are operating off of this task list every day. So they ultimately can get better control and then develop that community. Walk through an example.
So very timely. We are working with a very large organization that every single person listening this knows the name of. I can't share the name, but we have a meeting today with the vice president of HR for the company to walk this person through the GPS. Now, this person has been handed a lot of priorities from their boss. And I'm sure this person, when he flows down to his directors and their managers, they all have a lot of priorities. But it starts by first and foremost asking, what's the goal? If we fast forward, here's a great question. If we fast forward to the end of this year and we are celebrating, what specifically did we accomplish? Or asked differently, how will we know if we're successful by the end of this year? And getting really clear on what the goal is that we're marching toward. And based on that, we then get to ask the question, that's the G in GPS, what are the priorities? The handful of major initiatives that if we just accomplish those would make accomplishing the big goal possible, and ranking them in order of priority. And then asking the question, what are the specific strategies or actions we can take to make those priorities possible, and ranking them in order of priority. And going a step further to say, who owns each one of these? Assigning ownership. When does it have to be done by? Going through this process is deeper than most people do. And it's a different way of thinking. but it's what yields extraordinary results.
I would definitely agree that this is not necessarily something that is intuitive and commonplace for many to do, because the perception in a work environment is about the amount of work that you do, not necessarily evaluated on impact coupled with importance.
Yes.
It's really about, well, I've did all these things. And as such, I've ticked through 10 items on my list today. Whether they have been important or not, that feels like personally a sense of accomplishment.
Yeah. And this, you're so not alone in this. This is so common. I mean, we get on the phone with leaders in excited companies that want to make part of the one thing part of their culture. We always ask them, what are the biggest challenges with time that your employees have? And it often comes down to a lack of prioritization. Leaders think they're being clear on what the priority is, but when you actually scale down the organization, individuals aren't clear on what their priorities really are. They're not sure what to do when priorities change. They're not feel empowered to say no. This is all super common stuff. And it's not a complex answer. It's actually surprisingly simple. It's just about having certain models that you can say, what are all the things that we could do? Let's rank them in order of priority and focus on the ones that we should do. Let's draw that line in the sand that until this is done, everything else is a distraction. And let's start to establish a common language so that people can behave appropriately in the moment.
And do you feel this element of having a common language is also one of the biggest barriers for people?
So good. So good. Yeah, because when somebody walks by and asks, hey, do you got a minute? It would be weird to stare at them for 10 seconds while you rack your brain. So we just blindly say yes. But when we go into companies, for an individual, and oftentimes it's the boss going to their direct report and trying to give them something, but to empower your direct reports to be able to say, hey, I'm actually in the middle of doing my one thing right now. Now, Connie, I just said that. Like, does that inherently carry some weight to you when I say that?
Yes. I mean, for me, it forces me to understand that you have a key priority.
Mm-hmm. And what does it inherently tell you to do?
Buzz off right now.
Yes, it does, in a respectful way. Or for somebody to say, hey, do you got a minute? And say, actually, I'm going into a time block right now. You know, there are certain elements of the one thing that even if you haven't read it, the words that I just used carried a certain weight to them. And when members of a team can start to have this really simple language, ultimately they establish a foundation of trust and respect. Respect that you are not here to be at my beck and call, always available for whatever I need. We're actually a team and no one succeeds alone, which means you have to be focusing on the things that matter most to you. I have to be focusing on the things that matter most to me. And we have to be able to win together.
Establishing that common model creates clarity, alignment, as well as a common language for everyone from the top down in an organization. Goals and priorities across the business become fully transparent. Employees see their place in it, and a structure of ownership and focus can be put in place. This changes the approach from doing the best that an individual can do to doing the best that can be done for everyone. Each person's work now has more value and purpose, leading to that team mentality to drive the greatest impact. But creating that common vision that everyone understands isn't something that many leaders were taught. One has to learn that habit of thinking in order of priority. Geoff explains.
Unless you had leadership in the company that was willing to make investments in training their people, you would never learn this. And that's why it doesn't exist in a lot of places. We hope to change that. But the answers are actually really, really simple. And it just comes down to having a basic model that anybody can do that creates clarity and alignment.
And what I walk away with is it starts with, it's really that clarity, but the process itself is about ruthless prioritization.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. I would argue one of the most powerful habits I have formed was the habit of thinking in order of priority. My favorite quote from The One Thing is from F.M. Alexander. He said, "People do not decide their futures. They decide their habits, and their habits decide their futures." So when I imagined the type of person that I wanted to become, a family man with a business rather than a businessman with a family, that would mean I would have to be as efficient and as effective as possible during the hours that I worked. And at a pre-prescribed time, I'd have to shut it down and actually be present with the people that mattered most to me. And in order to make this vision possible, I had to know what my priorities were. And the one thing I could do to know my priorities would be to develop the habit of just thinking in order of priority. And the one thing I could do to think in order of priority was to look at a model we use called a 411 that gives you clarity on your personal priorities, to check my 411 before I checked my email, to check my priorities before I checked everyone else's, which, make no mistake about it, that is exactly what most people's inboxes are. It's just everybody else's stuff. And just by going on this 66-day challenge, which is every day you do your one thing for 66 days until it becomes a habit, of just looking at my 411 before I looked at my inbox, I became the type of person who saw my number one priority and saw everything else as a distraction. And it was like, Connie, I had been living my entire life living in black and white. And for the first time, I saw color. It was amazing.
So it helped you better understand at the end of the day, what really mattered, what was most important, and what would have the greatest, ultimately the impact that you were looking to achieve.
Yeah. Well,
so tell me more though about, when you operationalize this and you get clarity on, that one thing, that goal, and then the priorities against that, which you rank order, and subsequently the strategies. How do you still break that down? Because I think that many in a work situation and even in their personal life still assume that you got to start big.
Yep.
And it's that big bang approach to everything. And you got to do it perfect the first time out of the gate. And if it's not, then it inhibits you from even trying.
Yeah. Well, we have a concept called think big, go small. It starts by thinking big. Yeah, think big. What is our big goal? What are the major priorities? What are those key strategies? The part that I pointed out that maybe people might have skipped over is assigning who owns each one of them and when does it have to be done by. And when we look at a GPS, like the GPS for our business, my name's not next to everything. In fact, it's next to the minority of things. Yet it's the ones that I own that then flow to my 411. And this is a tool that we have where I declare these are the top 3 to 5 major priorities that I have for the year, personally and professionally. Now, let's be really clear, Connie. I have a lot more on my plate this year than 3 to 5 things. Yet these are the 3 to 5 major 20%ers that are going to generate 80% of the results. And based on that, it then shows these are the 3 to 5 major priorities I have to accomplish this month to be on track for my year. And then based on that, there's one more section. These are the 3 to 5 major priorities I have to focus on this week so that I know I'm on track for my month, which automatically puts me on track for my year, which automatically ensures that I am aligned and owning my part of the overall business plan. And when I open up my One Thing planner and my digital calendar and do my time blocking for the week, I time block those priorities first, and everything else is treated like a distraction. And as leaders, when we sit down with our employees on a weekly basis, that employee brings their 411 to the table. They declare to us, these are my priorities for the week so that I know I'm on track for my month. So I know I'm on track for my year. So I know I'm on track for owning the pieces of the business plan that I own. You create alignment, focus, clarity, accountability. It all becomes possible.
So I take away, and I can even visualize this right now, where you have the goal at the top and you are breaking it down into its finer and finer parts where the priorities lead to the strategy, which leads to the tactics. But the tactics are also prioritized and also in a hierarchy.
Bingo.
So that you understand ultimately the laddering effect of what's at the very bottom to start with that can be done on a very tactical level day to day, which then you understand how that moves upward towards a weekly and monthly task list, which aligns to goals and results, which then you know you're making progress. But if everybody can have the other piece that I walked away is the visibility and transparency into what you're working against so that it creates the alignment. In this way, collectively, you're working together as a pretty well-oiled machine, similar to the tech field where I spend a lot of my time. I think of, agile development and how people are building software these days, which is small, iterative.
Agile is the one thing, Connie. This company we were working with, their tech team, and especially tech in most companies is a central services department. They support everybody. So you've got demand coming in from everyone in the organization. How do you know what to do? Well, Agile says, identify your one thing, do a sprint on it, and backlog everything else.
Right.
It's the same thing. The question is, how do you give your developers a common language so that when things pop up, how do you protect against corrupted development time? And how do you communicate to each of the departments where they fall in order of priority so they know when they're going to get their stuff?
The concept of thinking big, going small enables one to see the hierarchy of priorities and activities from the strategic vision all the way down to the tactical day-to-day tasks. What's also important is knowing how to minimize the distractions that can take you off those tasks that matter most. So what does it take?
There's multiple things. So time blocking is the act of scheduling time with yourself for your most important priorities. Mistake number one is that people just don't do it. Most people, when they go to schedule their weeks, they open a digital calendar, they see everything that's scheduled, and they just try to fit stuff in the time that remains. And it's just kind of like first come, first serve. Somebody says, hey, can you meet this week? They look at their digital calendar, and if they see a spot, they say yes, without asking, if I could only schedule one thing, is this it? So part of time blocking is giving yourself permission to view your time like a blank slate, to have clarity on what your priorities are first, to put those boulders in the middle of the stream so that when the water hits it, what does it do, Connie?
Ripple.
It goes around it. That's right. So step one in time blocking is you actually have to block it. Then step two is you actually have to protect it. And this is the big thing. People have scheduled time with themselves, but then they just violate it. And that's where the inability to say no is a thief of productivity.
So the other thing that I walk away with is that shift your mindset from having it be around task-based time blocking, so to speak, to truly being around goal-based time blocking. And that goal-based time blocking has to be centered around clarity of that one thing.
Yeah, and I think what I'm hearing you say, Connie, is versus saying, there's one way to say, I'm time blocking 1 hour versus saying, no, my one thing is generating X number of leads today, or setting Y number of appointments, or finishing our tech stack migration. And until your number one priority is done, everything else is a distraction. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
Well, I'm here, yes, purposeful.
Yeah.
So it's about really being purposeful time blocking and ensuring that there's clarity on what you want to accomplish during that period is what I walk away with.
That's right. And so for the point that I made, if people are going, well, yeah, which one should I do? Is it a set amount of time, or is it? The answer is, what can you do? Start with what you can do. There's no right or wrong. I'd say the majority of my time blocks are for a set amount of time. And sometimes if I don't finish my number one priority in those, some of the other stuff is getting canceled. I'm erasing it so I can replace it with what matters most. But to Connie's point, it's being clear. It's that clarity on what your priorities are so that you can move the ball on what matters most first.
time blocking is most effective when it is purposeful and when it is protected. And be clear on what you can do during that time in addition to what and why you're doing it. This premise is also relevant when it comes to one's own personal life, as Geoff believes personal and professional fulfillment are intrinsically linked. It was Geoff's own need to have clarity around his definition of career success, identifying his personal purpose and mission, coupled with the support in achieving them that continues to shape the impact he wants to have today.
Yeah, I remember when I first got into the workforce, I thought a career was just about working hard, getting promoted, working hard, getting promoted, saving up money, working up the chain, saving up money so that you could live the kind of life you want to be living. Yet today, when we think about the point of, we want to build a big business so that we can fund big lives. Big is not a bad thing. So everything that we do is about how do we build a big business that makes a big impact and can fund a really big life that further allows us to make a bigger impact. The question is, are you living a life worth living? A lot of people are so focused on just looking a year out. They're so focused on their income this year, what they're doing this year. They're more interested in having a great year than having a great career. So my focus shifted from what's my title or what's my job to what skills am I learning? On a day-to-day basis, who's the person I have to become to be successful in this role? And how does that serve my overall mission? How does that serve my goals for someday from now? How does that put me on track for where I want to be 5 years from now? That's how I think about it today.
And what's interesting is you have this mindset that I think certainly is very prevalent in the millennial generation, where they are looking for purpose, impact from the get-go, versus other generations where it might have been more singularly focused around wealth.
That's right.
And moving up that corporate ladder without taking a step back and realizing, well, what is it all going to be for at the end of the day?
And this is where, when we talk about some of the models we've talked about here, being the GPS and a 411, when we'll use a millennial as an example. I am a millennial, by the way. So when I do an action, I want a trophy immediately. And it's amazing. My partner, Jay, still has not given me one. I'm just about that. But when you suddenly are expected as an individual contributor to show up on a weekly basis to your manager and submit to your manager, these are what I think I can be doing this week to be on track for my month, to be on track for my year, so I know I'm in alignment with your goals and the division's GPS. You're giving that person ownership. And when you use the type of coaching questions that we teach people to ask, all of a sudden you're developing that person on a weekly basis, and that person starts to feel a sense of belonging. They start to know how to develop a sense of purpose versus crossing their fingers and hope that it's like the heavens open up from above them and all of a sudden they have purpose. That's not how it happens. So much of what we talk about is how do we help people live a life worth living? We believe that if somebody comes and works with us, we have a sacred obligation to help them get what they want out of life. And the number one reason that somebody leaves a job is because they wake up one day and they realize they can't have everything they want by being inside your world. And almost always it's something that's missing in their personal life that they were hoping gets fulfilled as a byproduct of being in business with you. So as leaders, like when we sit down and do 411s, I'm seeing their priorities for the year professionally and personally.
So you're ensuring that their personal goals are aligned.
Are being met by being in business with us. Yes.
And I'm assuming you don't really see as much of a distinction between personal goals and professional goals necessarily, because this notion of when you accomplish those things that are your personal goals, you're going to feel more fulfilled professionally.
Or we can flip it. If we looked at my 411, my number one personal priority for the year, it says 36 date nights with my wife. And at the time of recording this, we're halfway through the year, which means I should be how many date nights in, Connie? If the goal for the year is 36, where should I be at the midway point?
Be at 18. Are you there?
I'm at 10. So the fact that during my last 411, when I submitted my 411 to my partner, Jay, and he looked at that and said, Geoff, I see that your number one priority for the year personally is 36 date nights with Amy and you're at 10. How do we support you in ensuring that you can make that gap up so that your marriage is as strong as it needs to be? Now, imagine if your boss asked you that question. How would you feel about them?
That they're invested.
Mm-hmm. This is how we create retention. This is how we create more productive people. Oftentimes people read the one thing, or if we ever come in and do a workshop, they think they're sitting in something for their business. This is just as much a personal journey as it is professional. We don't coach to the employee. We coach to the whole person. That's what it looks like.
And it sounds like you actually coach to that person's ecosystem, or coach that person to really think about their full ecosystem personally and professionally.
Bingo.
If they don't consider the broad components that influence that, then no one will ever be successful in accomplishing their goals.
That's right. That's right.
So what's some of the best work advice you've ever received?
Definitely that story of the GPS story of Gary tearing my GPS, making me tear my GPS snap, just saying, until your number one priority is done, everything else is a distraction. I mean, that to me is so, so good. The understanding that as a leader, we have to care just as much about people's personal lives as we do their professional lives, and being willing to support them and coach them as much as they're willing to allow us. You can't require it. That's not legal, but you can create the type of environment where people are willing to share. And the final thing is, standards without consequences are merely suggestions. As leaders, a lot of us think we know what our standards are and we think we've communicated them, but what we've actually communicated are suggestions, because our actions don't bring consequences when they get violated. And so part of this is having time for you as a leader to sit down and really ask the question, what are my standards? Or asked differently, how do you lose with me? What are the things you can do that you absolutely lose with me? And how do I communicate that with my team so that they're clear on it and I'm clear on how I lose with them? And when that line gets crossed, what does the consequence look like? And it doesn't have to be some crazy, thou shalt not come to a meeting without clarity on your priorities. But it could be as simple as a conversation. Hey, I noticed that you showed up this week and your 411 wasn't done. You know that in this culture, we have clarity on our priorities before the week begins. What stopped you?
And that's given you a common language to be able to have a very productive discussion.
Bingo.
So that everyone can be on the same page and move forward in a very positive way.
Mm-hmm.
And to close, knowing what you know now, what advice would you give your younger self?
I gave this advice to my 5-year-old. I sat down with her and I said, Daphne, can Daddy share his favorite quote with you? And she said, yeah. And I said, Daphne, people do not decide their futures. They decide their habits. And their habits decide their futures. And at the time, we had just gotten 2 baby kittens. And I said, Daphne, do you want to be the best mommy possible for the kitties? And she went, yeah. And I said, well, Daphne, what's one thing you can do that would make you an amazing mommy for the kitties? And she said, give them space when they need it. Give them lots of energy. And I was like, oh my gosh, you adorable little thing. I said, honey, what about food? And she goes, and food. I said, well, honey, do you want to be in charge of feeding the kitties? And she's like, yeah. I said, well, how about every day? And I showed her a 66-day challenge calendar. This is a single sheet that has 66 days on it. So every day you do your one thing, you put a big red X on it. And pretty soon it becomes less about doing the one thing and more about not breaking the chain. So it's self-accountability. And I said, honey, every day that you feed the kitties, you're going to put an X on this calendar. And she goes, yeah, I'm so excited. I'm going to explode. But you fast forward a very short period of time. I didn't have to ask Daphne to feed the cats anymore. It had become a habit. We then earned the right to have a conversation about kitty litter. And that one didn't work. But my younger self, I wish I know what it feels like to be early in any place in your life, to look out into the future at something that you want, to not have it yet, and to feel bad because there's a gap between where you are and where you want to be. And instead of focusing on the gap, asking a different question: who's the person I can become? What's the habit I can form that would make that future reality possible?
I love that. And finally, what's the best way listeners can connect with you?
Oh, thank you. So you're already listening to podcasts. So we have a podcast. It's called The One Thing, the ONETHING. So the one all spelled out. Our website is theonething.com, and it's with the number one. So then the number one thing.com. And for those of you that are leaders inside of organizations, click on the training page. You can learn what we do from a corporate standpoint. But we're just so passionate about helping leaders change the culture so that people invest every second like it's their most valuable resource, because it is.
Thank you so much for your time today, Geoff, and giving us that framework of understanding to become more productive in our work and life, and having that understanding of getting that clarity, the control, so that you can build the community, so you can find that purpose that you're searching for.
That's it. And we referenced a lot of tools like the GPS, the 411. If you go to theonething.com and click on free stuff, you'll see it all there.
Wonderful. Thanks so much.
Awesome. Thanks, Connie.
The simple truth, Geoff tells us, is that extraordinary results don't come from doing more. It comes from doing more of what matters most. And that starts by thinking big and going small, identifying the most important 20% of activities that will create 80% of your results. Ensure that you have clarity on your priorities, control of your time, and establish that common language, all to create alignment and a sense of community so everyone wins together. And this model applies not only in your work life, but also your personal life. And particularly as a leader, you have to care about what both means to your employees to create an environment where they feel fulfilled holistically. Because when you create habits of thinking and doing in priority, this decides your future. And that future is where you will be able to ensure your time is managed wisely to achieve the momentum that you are looking for. Thanks for listening to the Strategic Momentum Podcast. You can connect with Geoff on LinkedIn at Geoff Woods, that's GeoffWoods, or visit theonething.com. That's THING.com. To get show notes, links, and more tips and advice from this episode, you can visit us at flywheelassociates.com/podcast. If you like what you heard, please share this episode with at least one person who you think benefit from understanding how to better manage their time. And please subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Connie Steele, and you've been listening to the Strategic Momentum Podcast.